did we choose Philippines and Singapore as a ground for comparison? Well, Philippines and Singapore are both part of Asia. Ang mga unang nanirahan sa Pilipinas ay mga Tabunman, Negritos at Malay. Gayon din sa Singapore dahil ang pinanggalingan ng bansang ito ay maiugnay sa Malay folklore. Ito ay nangangahulugan na kung anong history of inhabitants ng Pilipinas ay maititrace back sa Singapore dahil bago ang global warming o yung Ice Age, ang mga kontinente ay konektado sa isa't isa, kaya ang mga settlers nagtatravel lang sila through land bridges. Sumunod naman, ang bansang ito ay may parehas na karanasan. Kung ang Pilipinas ay sinakop ng Spain, Amerika at Japan, ang Singapore naman ay sinakop ng Britain, ng Japan at naging parte sila ng Malaysia. Sinakop sila ng British East India Company noong 1824, ng Japanese noong February 1942 at naging parte sila ng Malaysia noong September 16, 1963. Gayunpaman, katulad nga ng Pilipinas who gained independence from Spaniards, Americans, and Japanese, Singapore also had independence from British, Japanese, and its separation from Malaysia on August 9, 1965. Now that these two have sovereignty and autonomy, both of them took different paths which created their present identity and condition of its own country were as comparable. Sa madaling salita, they can really be a ground for comparison sa kabila ng parehas nila o halos parehas nilang karanasan from the past. And after a series of events, they were able to establish their distinction. At upang mas lalo itong maintindihan, maipaliliwanag ito sa mga susunod na diskusyon. Kung kaya naman, sabay-sabay natin itong alamin at pakinggan.
Comparing two countries is necessary to have an in-depth analysis and research in comparabilities. For instance, we take on this challenge to compare two infamous countries in Asia, the Singapore and Philippines. We will first tackle about the differences and similarities of the two countries in terms of their politics. Now let us start the discussion.
Politics in Singapore versus Philippines. Singapore and Philippines have similarities and also distinct disparities. Singapore and Philippines is both democratic and republic, meaning the power is bestowed to the citizen in choosing government officials through the process of free and fair elections. Singapore is also parliamentary, while Philippines is unitary. Parliamentary is a system in which the executives are composed of cabinet members and the ruling power is vested to the Prime Minister. In Philippines, being a unitary, it is the process in which the central power is in the national government and the president control and rule over the local government units. Political party system. Singapore and Philippines, as both democratic and republican states, they permit multi-party system. Some of the popular party system in Singapore are People's Action Party, National Solidarity Party, Reform Party, and many more. While in Philippines, we have Labanan Demokratikong Pilipino, Lakas CMD, Liberal Party, and Nationalist People's Coalition. State of politics or political culture. This is the biggest gap between Singapore and Philippines. In Singapore, the government officials are bureaucratic officials that are concerned with the total development of the country, genuinely care for the common good, acted as a whole, and loyal to their principles. While in Philippines, they view political culture in the Philippines as filthy. Almost every Filipinos believe that politicians in the Philippines are corrupt, thieves, and inflicted with self-interest. Political dynasties also run in the Philippines for decades and still evident today.
In the 1950s, the Philippines was once hailed as one of Asia's thriving nations and commended for its economic growth by the World Bank. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, it became one of the poorest in Asian countries up until today. In contrast, Singapore in the 1960s was a once third world country and people barely lived in scraps. But just in 5 decades, it rose to become one of the most affluent states in Asia today. What is the role of the government in here? Let's find it out.
Let's discuss the type of government these two countries have. The Philippines has presidential system and 3 main branches that adhere to the principle of separation of power. First is the executive branch where the president belongs. Second, the legislative branch has the power to authorize, modify, and revoke laws. Lastly, the judicial branch that presided over legal conflicts regarding administrative affairs. Meanwhile, Singapore as a parliamentary have a prime minister, the head of the government, and the president as the head of the state. The parliament is unicameral and consists of 84 elected members for a 5-year term in office and 9 nominated nominated non-partisan members appointed by the president, serving for 2 years. Next is the impact of foreign colonization on the government. Spaniards colonized Philippines for 333 years, resulting to major influence in the society. After Spaniards, American takeover in which the Philippines presidential system were inherited from. It was first founded from the morally tainted bureaucracy and corruption introduced by the Spanish settlers. Not to mention the Marcos martial law regime. The momentary stability Philippines has been disrupted. Authoritarianism rose along with frequent changes in political leadership. Philippine politics became unstable and its repercussions lasted until today. For 140 years, Singapore was under the rule of Britain and Singapore Civil Service was established. During this time, they focused on maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, and building public infrastructures, but it does not involve national development. After their independence, they started to reform the rules inclined to the country's development. As SCS were not equipped for socio-economic development, they adapt and alter the meritocracy system from the British to ensure the recruitment and promotion of the best and brightest Singaporean in the civil service sector, which acts as their jumpstart to rebuild their country from dust.
Lastly, ways on how this country's government governed. Philippines continue to adhere to its traditional norms and practices that shackle them to not improve and prosper, while Singapore stretched their constraints to cope up with the worldwide trend. Singaporeans break their routine, which concluded the success of their government. Singaporean political leaders seek and apply efficient solutions for their country's dilemma, while Philippine higher-ups were trapped in traditional and toxic norms, arousing continuous failed leadership during their years in power.
So we are then now discussing the difference and similarities in terms of politics and government of Singapore and the Philippines. So now, I will discuss the difference and similarities in terms of their economy.
So let's take a look at the difference. Philippines is under mixed economy, meaning pwedeng makialam ang gobyerno sa kahit na anong usapin tungkol sa ekonomiya. Sumunod naman, rich in natural resources. Kilala ang Pilipinas sa pagkakaroon ng mayaman na resources, lalo na pagdating sa pagsasaka at pangingisda na siyang pangunahing pamumuhay ng mga Pilipino. And in terms of unemployment rate, as of 2021, nakapagtala ng 8.9% unemployment rate ang Pilipinas. Ito ay equivalent sa 2.4 milyong Pilipino. Isa sa mga naging dahilan ng paglobo ng bilang ay ang kinakaharap nating pandemya. Kaya naman bumagsak din talaga ang ekonomiya ng Pilipinas. On the other hand, Singapore is known for being a highly developed country and successful free-market economy. They enjoyed the open and corruption-free environment. Unlike sa Pilipinas, stable ang prices sa Singapore. They are also known for being an industrialized country. That's why, in terms of natural resources, they are lacking. Probably because Singapore are dependent on the export coming from the other country. And in terms of unemployment rate, Singapore has very low percentage compared to the Philippines. Despite of the differences between these two countries, meron pa rin naman silang similarities. First, both experience economic appeal. Ngunit kahit na ganun, pareho rin naman silang nakabangon at kung titignan, pareho na rin malayo ang narating ng parehong bansang ito. Kilala rin ang dalawang bansang ito sa pagiging competitive country. May sarili-sarili silang strength and weaknesses at alam nila kung paano ito i-utilize. At higit sa lahat, ay bukas sila sa mga trade and investment para sa kaiuunlad ng kanilang ekonomiya. And additional information, isa rin sa tinignan kong factor sa ekonomiya ng isang bansa ay ang crime rate at ang taxes nila. Dahil according sa research, having a bad image daw can be a reason para hindi tayo maka-attract ng mga foreign investment dahil pinapriority nila ang safety. At also, nalaman ko rin na ang Pilipinas ay mas mataas ang taxes na binabayaran kumpara sa mga Singaporeans.
To end this, Philippines and Singapore has a certain distinction. The government and politics of Philippines is rooted in United States, while Singapore's relative with some European countries such as United Kingdom, Belgium, and France. Also, there's a huge gap between their economic status since Singapore is dominating and highly developed, while Philippines still developing, but they can still somehow compete.